My name is Javier Kielmanowicz. I'm going to talk about transitioning to Angular 2 apps. So I'll give you a quick intro about myself before we start. I'm originally from Argentina. I work at Cargo. We're an ad tech company. Been there for about 4 years. And I've been working on Angular 1 and 2 projects during that time, most recently Angular 2. So I did see several comments in the meetup about people that are anxious to get started with Angular 2 or haven't tried it yet and are excited about the opportunity. So hopefully, if there's anything you leave here with, it's that you should definitely try it, and I'll give you some pointers along the way for getting to it. One thing that I will focus on is definitely more of the team growing aspect of working with Angular 2, because I've been working on a pretty large team for my time at Cargo, and during that time we've one of the big focuses has been not only how do we build new technology and how do we work with Angular, but how do we grow our development team with that. So I'll focus on some of those things. And by the way, Cargo is hiring Angular engineers, so if you're interested, our site's right there, and you're welcome to come talk to me later on. So even before I start, I'll just flat out tell you what takeaways I want you to leave this presentation with. Firstly, Angular 2 is a huge upgrade over Angular 1. We've been very, very happy with it. So again, I just want to stress that and encourage you all to try it out. And secondly, Cargo has quite a few tech products and web applications. And we've taken a couple different approaches to upgrading. So if there's one sort of major lesson I've learned that I would also share with you guys, it's that there isn't a one-stop solution for everything. There's different ways to upgrade, and there's different approaches to it. So we'll talk about some of the different ones and why and how you should choose the right upgrade approach. And again, for those of you that do have experience with Angular 2, hopefully this is sort of a lot of it may be repeat, and maybe you'll learn a couple new tricks on the way. If you haven't tried Angular 2, hopefully I'll show you how easy it is to get started. So agenda, I'm going to do a quick Cargo overview just because, as I mentioned before, a big part of what I want to talk about today is not just using Angular 2, but how we've grown a team around it. So for those of you that work in companies with large development teams, or if you're working on a project with more than, let's say, 5 or 10 people, there's a lot of lessons that we've learned along the way as we've grown and hired, and I'll try to touch on some of those. I'll talk about why we're using Angular 2 and how we got there, and Angular in and of itself. And then I'll go into actual transitioning from Angular 1 to 2. Finally, set up an architecture for some of our projects at Cargo, and then we can do a brief Q&A. I'm going to focus definitely on real-life applications. This won't be sort of a tutorial on how to build one quick feature. It's going to be more of the, I want to build a complex real-life production use application. How do I go about doing that? And I'll try to show, I'm going to try to pull this off and show some code whenever possible and demos so that it's not just text for you guys. So with that being said, quick overview of Cargo. Cargo, I'm guessing most of you don't really know it. We're not known that much outside of our industry, which is ad tech. But within the industry, we're a pretty big player. So Cargo is an editorial alliance of 300+ premium sites and apps for mobile only. What that means is that we basically have this large network of premium publishers, probably all the sites that many of you visit on your mobile devices, and we help our advertiser partners reach the right audiences for their brands to be recognized. And to do that, we built technology that enables our partners to buy at scale and with simplicity. We have about 10 to 15 different tech products that together form what we call Cargo Marketplace. And you'll see here, I put a quick diagram of where we kind of sit. You'll see Facebook and Google there next to us. Obviously, since you guys don't know us, we don't make, we don't have a mobile app for you guys to share pictures with your friends, or we're not a search engine, but we do sort of work in the same area as Google and Facebook when it comes to advertising. As an advertiser, if you're Procter & Gamble, Unilever, McDonald's, any of these major brands, you might go to Google and do search advertising. You might go to Facebook and do in-feed advertising in their apps or sites. but there's sort of one piece missing there, which is the editorial alliance, and that's what that's sort of the area that we fill in. So if, as an advertiser, they want to go to CNN and New York Times and TechCrunch and a bunch of different mobile sites where most people are spending most of their time these days, they come to Cargo for that. Really quick, that's just some of the companies we work with so you get an idea. So, engineering at Cargo. And again, I want to talk about this in the context of how we've grown with Angular 2, because I think that we've been paying very close attention to Angular and how it's developed. I think we were pretty early adopters with Angular. I was actually just at a conference a couple months ago with about 1,000 people in attendance, and the speaker said, "How many people here are using Angular 2 in production?" And I was one of the few people that raised my hand. So I know it is very new, and I know a lot of people are kind of a little bit scared to use it. So I guess part of what I'm here to say is it is production ready, in my opinion. So we'll talk about that. But anyway, how our team has grown, we've been kind of doubling in size year over year, almost every year that I've been at Cargo. We basically dove into Angular 1 as a prototype project for a web application and quickly saw success. We were able to build a new UI much, much faster than before. And that was back in 2014 with just one developer. We scaled up to about 4 Angular developers in 2015. And then last year, we tried Angular 2 while it was still in beta and in the release candidate phases. But we saw very, very quick sort of adoption on our teams. We're now up to about 16 out of a total dev team of about mid-30s. We're using both Angular 1 and 2 right now, and that's what I'm going to continue talking about. But the key thing is we've seen very, one of the things that we were worried about early on is, should we make this jump to 2? Is it going to mean a lot of new learning and a lot of new complexity for new developers? It's actually meant the opposite. We've had people that had no Angular experience, and they've come in and sort of picked it up right on the spot. So really, really happy with it overall. So I'll give you a quick overview of what we can do with Angular. As most of you probably know, browsers and JavaScript overall have gotten super, super powerful over the last 5 years or so. But I think it's important to step back and look at kind of what you can do with it. And then we'll go into how we get there. If you haven't worked with any sort of large-scale projects like this, I'll talk about some of the techniques to get there. So real quickly, I recorded a couple things just to show you. This is sort of a buying interface very similar to a shopping site like a clothing retail or whatever. And this is built with Angular 2. So I won't get into too many details of what's going on, but if I quickly play this, you can see it's a pretty rich interface. It's a whole workflow. This is where you can browse what sites you want to put your ads on. We've got all kinds of filtering in there. Pretty kind of it's not a static site. There's a lot of things going on here, and there's actually a lot of business logic going on behind the scenes. And this is, as I mentioned, this we built in Angular 2. It took about maybe 2 months with a 4 to 5 person dev team, which I think is pretty quick for something of this scale, and we already have this in production. Another quick example, this one we call Ad Builder Lite, and as you can see, similar UI. We're able to leverage the sharing of components across them, and I'll jump into exactly how we do that in specifics in one of my next slides. This one is sort of just to design an ad. So someone with or without design experience can come in here, drag and drop a couple images, and they get a pretty cool looking ad. It's got a built-in image editor. This thing actually has video editing as well. So it's, again, I'm just trying to demonstrate sort of the complexity of what we've been able to do with Angular 2. This one is also an Angular 2 product. This one is Angular 1, and my last demo. I'll just show this one in the browser because it's actually pretty cool. We call this Cargo Ad Builder. This is, if you've used Photoshop, it should probably look fairly familiar, but we've built this in the web. This is using Canvas, and apart from that, it's really just Angular directives and components. What this does is it lets you drop images like this. This is an ad that expands when you click on it. So this is the expanded page. As you can see, Bill Murray's there, and then I just put a soccer ball that animates up, and it sort of goes off the screen there. As you can tell, I'm not an ad designer. I just put this together, but I was able to put this ad together in just a couple minutes. I'll show you what it looks like. So it's, again, a very, very sort of rich tool. It can do animations. It can do image cropping and things like that. Again, just trying to show you the power of these tools, because if you haven't built complex UIs for browsers, I'm still amazed. I've been working on these things for years, and I'm still amazed at the things we can do with them. So, why we chose Angular? I do quite a bit of interviewing, and one of the most common questions or sort of comments I get in interviews is, why not React? A lot of people like React these days, so I thought I'd touch on this really quickly. I think React is great, but I will say we chose Angular for quite a few reasons. It was easy to prototype with. Back when we started on our first Angular app, we were able to get something up and running in just a week or two. We have several engineers, or at the time, this was back in 2014 or so, with Angular experience, and we thought that was a great start. Angular has a huge community of support. If you just check out Stack Overflow, you'll see nonstop questions answered about that, and that was really important to us. And the most important things, I would say, are we wanted a consistent framework and coding style so that any developer can sort of jump on a project and quickly understand how things are pieced together. Now, I mentioned to you when I first started speaking just now that one of the most important things for us at Cargo has not just been how do we build apps with Angular, but how do we grow a team with Angular. So if you work on a large development team, I think that this is one of the almost best benefits of Angular, the fact that it has this consistency. So anyone that has worked with Angular versus React or some of the other modern web frameworks knows that Angular is opinionated. The second version is less opinionated than the first one probably, but it still is a pretty opinionated framework. And a lot of people criticize that. I would say to you, that's actually a really good thing. We have a team of about 35 developers, and when a new one gets onboarded, it's been really, really important and beneficial to us that people can come in and they can see what we've built and very quickly jump from app to app. We have people that can work on 5 different applications and context switch day to day, and that's only possible because we have an opinionated framework that's forced us to build things in sort of a consistent way. A lot of different apps using different frameworks, you'll see a totally different implementation based on who actually worked on it. So it's one of the best things about it, in my opinion. Now, upgrading to Angular 2. So how you upgrade to Angular 2, first of all, I think really depends on your application and what you're doing. We upgraded, if you remember that Shops application I showed before, that was our sort of first upgrade. That was an Angular 1 application, and we ended up totally rewriting it in Angular 2. The ad builder one that I showed at the end with the cat and with Bill Murray, that's an Angular 1 app, and we're still sort of in the process of upgrading that, but we've learned a couple things on the way. So a lot of this, if you've looked at Angular's upgrade guide, you've probably seen before, but I'll just touch on it quickly. If you do have an Angular 1 project and you're considering upgrading it, first thing to do is to make sure that you're on the latest version, obviously before 2, and make sure that you're following all the best practices. So one of the biggest recommendations towards as the Angular release date approached for Angular 2, they recommended switching over to components, which were a newer feature. I believe they were introduced in 1.5 or 1.6. They had a recommended folder structure to follow, so definitely do that. That's one thing that we found that made it much easier to upgrade. Now, the other big thing is the Angular team has an upgrade module that essentially allows you to run Angular 1 and 2 in the same application. This is sort of one of the areas where we didn't find the most success with Angular team's recommendations, and I'll tell you exactly why. So you should have different approaches for different apps. Marketplace is sort of our biggest production application. It has the most users. It has between 50 and 100 users on a daily basis, and it was a very large code base, specifically Angular code base. Obviously, it has a backend component too, but we had a lot of JavaScript code. With this one, we simply decided it's not worth upgrading to Angular 2, right now at least. One of the things you should consider is definitely the risk involved. And with this one, we decided there was the risk to benefit because it was a fairly developed and mature application that we weren't adding too much on the UI to. It was not worth it at the time. Now, as a counterpoint to that, Shops, the one that I showed before, that was sort of a buying interface with the next, and you choose what you want to buy. That one actually coincided with a beta release. We did not have a ton of production users yet. And that one, we just said, you know what? Let's start over with Angular 2. And that turned out to be much faster and much easier than using the upgrade module. So, it's definitely a trade-off, and you need to consider how many production users you have. And then, as a sort of middle-pronged approach, I wanted to present that ad builder, the one that was the Photoshop-like tool. For that one, we've gone with the middle-of-the-road approach. So that one is still an Angular 1 app. We are using the upgrade module for now. We're still in the process of setting that up. But our plan is to run 1 and 2 side by side there. So I present these 3 as sort of counter arguments for you guys to consider, because it's really important to look at the size of your app, how many users it has, how big is the code base, what's your sort of tolerance for risk. And you can see here that we've made 3 different approaches in 3 different places. So I definitely wouldn't say that you should just go ahead and upgrade. I'm a huge fan of Angular 2. I think it's a huge upgrade on Angular 1, but you should take these things into consideration and not just blindly upgrade. Now, of course, with new apps, we are exclusively building them in Angular 2. So I will say I do feel that Angular 2 is production ready. We already have applications in production, no real issues so far. Now, I said no real issues, but we did learn some things on the way, and we did have some smaller issues. One of the things to sort of watch out for and that we ran into was we were pretty early to the game, as I mentioned. I believe the final release candidate for Angular 2 was maybe around October of last year. We were using the early release candidates, I think as early as the RC1, maybe RC2, and we followed along the way, keeping up to date as the Angular team released their release candidates. But because we were pretty early to the game, there were several third-party libraries that were just not ready, and they turned out to be too complicated to use. So first thing I would recommend is don't use third-party libraries if they're not ready and they're not Angular 2 ready, because that can just be a huge waste of time. You're probably better off writing your own. Another thing that we learned that, again, this is something that maybe this is documented somewhere by this point, but back when we were working with the early release candidates, we didn't know what the best way was to apply styles to our application. And when I talk about styles, I mean, so for those of you that aren't familiar, that haven't touched Angular 2 too much yet, one of the great new features that it has is view encapsulation. What that means is you can create a UI component, and I'll show some examples of this in a second, but you can create a UI component, let's say some widget or some graph or whatever, and you can apply styles to it in a componentized way that won't leak to the rest of your application. So what that means is you're free to use class names like header or title or something very, traditionally you wouldn't want to use class names like that because they're too generic and they could end up applying to the wrong elements. With Angular 2, there's this view encapsulation feature, which means that you can create styles like that and you don't have to worry about that leaking across the app. But there's still typically styles that you do want to apply to the whole app, like top-level colors, header sizes, things like that. So I'll show you in just a second how we did that. It's really easy. But before I do that, I'll just touch on these last 2. It's been much easier for developers of all different skill levels to contribute to our Angular 2 projects, much shorter dev time, and much easier for people to have a large impact. Part of the reason for that, and let me just jump into code for a second here. Part of the reason for that, for the fact that people have been able to have a much larger contribution, is, in my opinion, there's a much better separation of concerns with Angular 2. Angular 1 partly did this, but just to talk specifically here. Sorry? Oh, yeah, sure. So let's say you have a component in Angular. This is just a UI component. Is that a little better? In Angular 2, for those of you that are not familiar, this is sort of the way the configuration looks. It's pretty straightforward. You can provide a template, you can provide different style sheets, and then you have your sort of code class, your TypeScript. The view encapsulation I was talking about is this. I can pull up this CSS file, and you can see I have class names as simple as edit or input option. These won't leak to the rest of the app. They'll only apply to this specific component, which is really great feature if you are, really for anyone, but I'll say if you are not a CSS expert, as a lot of people on my team are, I'm sure as most of you are familiar with too, it becomes much easier to name your classes and to apply those styles because you can do things like this that traditionally were sort of a bad idea. Now, I wanted to touch on one thing that was a kind of big aha moment for us at on the early stages. In Angular 2, you have an app component, which is sort of your top-level page, if you will. One really cool thing that we figured out early on is we wanted to use this view encapsulation throughout our app. So for example, if I build a card component or a graph or a little widget, I want to be able to style that and have those styles not leak to the rest of the application. But I also wanted to have, let's say, colors and header sizes and font sizes that do apply to the whole application. You don't want to apply those to each of your components. You want that to apply to the whole app. So what we did here, super simple, view encapsulation none on the app component. And then we actually just applied this style sheet that basically applies for the whole app. So we're just importing a base sheet that's right here. As you can see, we've got colors, fonts, layers. This is really sort of generic things you want everywhere. A reset, pretty straightforward. But what this let us do is, I can actually show you real quick. Bring up the inspector here. This is what Angular 2 does if you're not familiar with it. It sort of appends these styles, and it normally prefixes them with, let's see if I can find one. Yeah, so you can see this. This is what Angular does. It prefixes your classes with these sort of randomized names, which is what prevents those styles from leaking across your application. But I believe this one is our app, the app component style sheet I just showed. So this is what has our columns and our sort of generic styles we do want to apply everywhere. And using that view encapsulation none on the app component is what let us basically have componentized styles, but still have app-level styles. Sort of an aha moment. We didn't see that initially in Angular's documentation, but it was a really kind of obvious and clean solution. So I'll touch a little bit on our architecture. Again, if you are familiar with Angular 2 with their documentation, it's pretty good. I really like it. Some of this will be repeat from that, but if you're starting with Angular 2, I'll point out some of the key practices you should follow. One of them is one component per file, and you should typically put your components in a single directory. Always use a descriptive name for your component, and they recommend dashes to separating the words in the component and dots to denote the type of file it is. So for example, if it's a service or component, you put .component.service at the end. Always use barrels to roll up your exports with an index.ts file and have a top-level app folder. So again, I'll quickly show this to you. I think these are all sort of, they're intuitive things, and they're the types of things that have really sped up our development and our onboarding of new developers. As we've scaled the team, we've really seen these things show a lot of promise in how much faster and easier it is to understand these tools. So, for example, this is a single component. You can see here there's the TypeScript file with the code, there's the CSS, and there's the HTML for it, all in one folder. And there's this index file, which is a barrel. Essentially, all it is an ES6 export. And what that lets you do is import just using the edit deal path instead of having to specify editdeal.component.ts. So just a little shortcut, but this is something that keeps your application very, very sort of organized and easy to follow. And if I just scroll up a little bit and toggle these things down, one other thing I'll touch on that's been sort of, again, with regards to team onboarding, we've brought in a lot of people to work on these things. And one of the things that has been really, really made it a quick process and easy to understand is that we've essentially kept this tool. If I show this to you, there's a page, for example. Let's see. Okay, so you can see here, this is the add units page. We won't get into what that is, but we have add units here. Very easy to follow. I'm sure any of you could jump in here and know exactly where to edit things. So we have basically top-level pages, and then there's actual components that belong to each page. Really easy interface, really intuitive. So if you're starting Angular 2, I hope that sort of encourages you to follow that. Oh, one quick thing I'll show also here with regards to the code is, I believe I have this up here. So just to sort of point of comparison, this is the app that we upgraded from Angular 1. It's called Shops. This was the sort of recommended directory structure while we were using Angular 1. It may have changed since then, but I just want to point it out because it is, again, a huge upgrade with Angular 2. The old recommended approach was to sort of folder your file types, constants, controllers, directive services. If you noticed in that Angular 2 app, it's a lot more, the approach that we've taken is a lot more page and component level, which makes it, what it makes it, the end result is that you don't have to understand the code base. You just understand how it works and where everything lives. And again, if you're going to scale a team up to more than 5 or 10 developers, that becomes increasingly important. Last thing I want to touch on is code reuse. With Angular and, well, with really any sort of, again, large-scale web framework, it's very, very important to reuse your code. If you're working on a sort of single-page small project on your own, this might not be important. But again, if you want to grow a team to this sort of scale, it's very, very important to be able to reuse things. So we've come up with this components, which is basically sort of our internal third-party widgets library. It's installed via NPM as a GitHub repo, uses standard ES6 imports, can be contributed to separately from our client apps like that Shops application. And so far, we just have a few components in there. I'll quickly show it again. So this is the Shops application. I just want to show quickly how you would do this. It's super easy. We basically have a GitHub repo for this components library. Here I have it commented out just because I'm developing in the components library, so I can actually reference my local file path. And obviously, if I'm developing, I don't want to have to push every change to GitHub to see it reflected in here. But all it is, I believe I have it here. This is the library itself. As you can see, one of the components we've built is a tags input component, standard Angular exports, and to use it, you just import it, just like anything else in ES6. So there's the tags input module imported, and you can just use it as any other Angular 2 component. So very easy to do. Again, it's one of those things that I think is maybe not always super obvious. If we did have to sort of search around for a while at the beginning doing that, but it's very intuitive. And one of the great things about Angular 2 is that it is entirely based on, if you look at all the recommended code and tutorials, everything has TypeScript and ES6. Really easy to use. These imports and exports in ES6 have definitely saved us a lot of time and made things a lot easier to grow and to expand on. So that's about it. I'll open up to any questions. And again, as a reminder, if some of those tools I showed you earlier, if you thought they were cool and it might be something you're interested in working on, please look for me after or go directly to our career site.